Dylan Tyrer, Austin Ward, Jacob Reimer with you on a Monday evening. Talking about some impact transfers within the Big Ten Conference as far as it goes with football in our last segment. And we're going to talk about some of the scheduling in the Big Ten Conference right now. Toughest schedules, easiest schedules. Brad Crawford of CBS Sports did a little ranking. 5 toughest and the 5 most favorable schedules within the Big Ten Conference. You said earlier you want to include Ohio State in these to get clicks. Ohio State not in this one.
Very surprised that they didn't. That's cardinal rule that they're breaking.
So the easiest schedule, or at least we'll call it the most favorable schedule in the Big Ten, goes to Maryland. And when looking at this slate of games, I'd have to say, yeah, it's not the most taxing. FAU, NIU, Towson, Wisconsin, Washington, Nebraska, UCLA, Indiana, Rutgers, Illinois, Michigan State. Not a whole lot in there.
Which will make it even more difficult for Mike Locksley to justify keeping his job when they miss a bowl game again this year.
Ooh.
Because you look at it and you say, yeah, if you're evaluating the strength of schedule, this is not a difficult schedule. But we're thinking about if Ohio State played it or if Penn State played it, that would be a pretty smooth run through it. But we're talking about Maryland playing it. So suddenly a trip like going out to UCLA is a little bit more daunting. Playing, Rutgers has been a little bit of a headache for them too. And so, yes, when you're comparing it, that becomes the challenge. Like, is this the most favorable? I mean, yeah, I guess that's all that Maryland could ask for. Does it mean that they're going to go 10-2? Definitely not.
So I'm pretty interested by the team that he's got with the second easiest schedule in the conference, and that's Oregon. Last year's Big Ten champion. They essentially, on paper, they've got a path back.
Yep.
What do you think about the slate for Oregon this year? Montana State, Oklahoma State, Northwestern, Oregon State, Penn State, Indiana, Rutgers, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, USC, in Washington. I can see a couple of games in there that could be surprise losses potentially based off of, hey, maybe USC's good this year. We talked about Iowa with their win total at 7.5 this season. Heck, maybe Washington can surprise them. But, I mean, it's kind of crazy to me to see no real marquee matchups for Oregon here. Penn State's obviously on the schedule, but nothing crazy out of conference.
One of the biggest games of the year. They're going, that's the whiteout in Happy Valley. So it's, they described it in this ranking as like a yellow brick road or, it's like they rolled out the carpet for Oregon. I don't know that that's the case here. They're very good. Oregon's going to be favored to win probably every single one of those games except the whiteout against Penn State. But they're going to be an interesting test of all the body clock and travel that we talked about a year ago, because you're talking about at Northwestern, at Penn State, at Rutgers, at Iowa. They have, the last road game for them is at Washington. They won't have, that's a normal travel setup for them, but that's a lot of going back and forth across the country for them. You wonder if that might trip them up at some point. Certainly they're going to have full attention on the Penn State game. It is at night. You have some chance to adjust there, but that'll wear on you going back and forth. And taking that trip all the way from Eugene to Piscataway, I don't think that's necessarily what the Ducks had in mind when they were signing up for Big Ten football.
As far as it goes with the toughest schedules in the conference, he's got Wisconsin slate ranked as the hardest, and USC's in there as well with the 4th toughest schedule. So those are a couple of ones where, hey, maybe Wisconsin picks up some big wins, games that we don't think they're going to win this season. Maybe that gets them in the conversation. Same goes for USC, I think. Maybe a surprise win here, surprise win there. Maybe that gets them into the conversation this season. You look at USC's schedule. They've got Michigan, Notre Dame, of course, another Iowa on there. They're going to go to Oregon, and, of course, they've got UCLA. So there's some marquee-ish games on there that you could see later in the season, them being meaningful.
Yeah, I get a kick out of these lists sometimes. And, yes, this is called the Buckeye Show. But for Ohio State to appear on the toughest schedule list, they would have to be playing themselves at some point. And so it's not a surprise that the 3 toughest on here, you have Wisconsin, you have Rutgers, you have Purdue. They all have to play Ohio State. So that is going to give them a boost no matter what. Ohio State, playing Texas, playing Penn State, playing Michigan is pretty difficult. And I think including, that road trip to play Illinois, that's a sneaky game to throw on there. Going to Camp Randall, that's not easy. So I was a little bit surprised. We joked about national media, how they have to put Ohio State pictures in the featured image, how they have to mention the Buckeyes in all these stories to make sure that they can capture, the attention and the eyeballs of the most passionate fan base in college football. I think there actually is a legitimate case to put the Buckeyes in here for this toughest schedule. They don't play themselves outside of the spring game. That's already behind them. So you factor that in. But playing Texas, as we talked about, there's a reason that Fox took it. It's going to be a top 3 matchup. Penn State's going to be one of the most important games in the college football season. The rivalry stands on its own in the Big House this year. But it's not just those games. You're factoring in those what used to be the old Big Ten West programs. Illinois is not going to be a pushover. Wisconsin, Luke Fickell, this is a make or break type of year for him. He cannot hold anything back. The last time the Buckeyes went up there 2 years ago, they got into a little bit more of a fist fight than they were anticipating. So it's not like you can just chalk those up as nothing. So I do think that maybe it's not the most difficult in the Big Ten, but just because Ohio State is going to be favored in every single one of those games doesn't mean that it's not difficult.
Yeah, I think I would definitely put Ohio State's schedule. I get that some of those other teams are on the list for having the toughest schedules, like you said, because they have to play Ohio State. But not a lot of these teams have that marquee non-conference matchup that Ohio State does. And obviously, that's huge when it comes to deciding rankings in the college football playoff and that sort of thing. People like to see those marquee matchups and early in a season, see how Ohio State stacks up against some of these better non-conference opponents. We've seen it the last few years with, it was going to be Oregon, right, before they were in the Big Ten. And Notre Dame, and we saw them face off, et cetera. I will say, though, you bring up that Wisconsin game going to Madison, and that's one that sticks out to me on the schedule for Ohio State this year, in that I hate using the whole trap game thing, right? Because I think everybody knows in college football how important every single game is every week. Now, with an expanded playoff, maybe not quite as important every week, but Ohio State can't necessarily afford to lose to a team like Wisconsin. But you look at the schedule, and you brought up liking Illinois a couple segments ago.
Yeah.
You said they're going to be a tougher opponent this year. I think a lot of people like Illinois this year as maybe a surprise team or an under-the-radar team in the Big Ten. So you're going to go to Illinois on October 11th and play there. Then you go to Madison a week later on the 18th and play there. And the next week, you've got Penn State in the shoe. Well,
after the
2 weeks. Yep. Yeah, they're going to have an off week, and then they've got Penn State in the shoe. That, to me, feels like an opportunity for Ohio State's going to have a first-year quarterback. They're going to have some new players on both sides of the ball. Of course, they've got returners from the national championship, but that feels to me like maybe a game that could be overlooked. Maybe.
Well, and you go into Champaign and get into that wind tunnel.
Yep.
Weird things happen there. It's going to be part of what we've seen with some of these closer games in the last few years when Ohio State has got into them, which doesn't happen very often. But you see maybe some times where they're bigger favorites, they don't cover the spread. What happens? You have an opponent that can take the air out of the football. We know that the Illini are going to, and Brett Bielema is going to be more than content to try and run the football, try and win as much of the time possession battle as he possibly can, and lean on a pretty rugged defense. Now, there's only and part of that is because there's only so many times you can stop Ohio State. New quarterback or not, Jeremiah Smith still on this team. Carnell Tate still on this team. Good backfield. Talked about C.J. Donaldson and James Peoples already. We know that Ohio State is going to be in position to put up points against anybody they play. But those games that have got a little bit wonky and a little bit sideways, and we don't, anything can happen with Big Ten weather, and it gets pretty weird at that particular stadium. That happens at Camp Randall too. Not saying that can't happen 2 weeks in a row, but the fact that you're also going, as you mentioned, you have to do that back to back. It's not easy, even when you're only going a handful of hours or a 2-hour flight. To do that back to back is a taxing thing on these younger athletes, even as elite as they are. But I just think, what's the formula there? Both of those teams historically would be able to run the ball and play defense. That's your best shot is to get into more of a slugfest against Ohio State. And I think both coaches, Luke Fickell and Brett Bielema, are very well aware of that and comfortable living in that world.
I'm curious to see what it all looks like, right? We're going to get a good indication week one. Obviously the quarterback is such a big question this year for Ohio State, but you're going to get a good indication week one of what that looks like. And if it doesn't look good, then I think a lot of the rest of the schedule, games like that become more interesting, right?
That's what sets up to be so interesting about the entire year, because in 2014, there was the uncertainty in the first couple of weeks, not just the Virginia Tech loss.
Right.
The opener looked rough, and it's like, okay, well, this is what happens when you have a new quarterback. Think about how different that looked by November as JT Barrett got comfortable. Now, Ohio State had to regroup and do this again with Cardale Jones, but it's a growth process. Like, Ohio State's got the biggest challenges stretched out a little bit, but I think to view this as only week one against Texas and November opening up against Penn State and then closing with the rivalry game would be unfair to diminish this challenge of going on the road back-to-back against capable opponents. Not Wisconsin is going to be a college football playoff contender. Illinois is still a little bit of a dark horse. They're picked to win, 7-8 games. I think they could exceed that, but those are good teams, and they're well coached, and they're not going to be shy about putting some pressure on Lincoln Kienholz or Julian Sayin, however that does shake out. So they do have to be ready once you start turning that page, because also, Washington, you have 3 road games really in this stretch of a month that are going to put your bodies through the test.
All right, guys. #Buckeyes coming at you next. It's the Buckeye Show on The Fan.